Here we go. Good morning and happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to another LinkedIn Live event by Rhyno Healthcare Solutions. Have to say there are often times when we have to really think about what topics we want to discuss and bring in the right partners. Sometimes they are just handed to us. We have Randy and Michelle who will do introductions shortly, but they are longtime friends and partners of Rhyno Healthcare. And this actually came about a month and a half ago. So a shout out to Steve Witter, who was in a governance conversation with you two, and kind of came back to me afterwards and said, you know what, they were so good talking with each other. It was such a great conversation. Maybe we should extend this out into a LinkedIn Live. And that's what we've been doing. So we put together a great topic for today, from blueprints to buy-in, how IT architecture and governance drive change. As you know, there's IT is a large conglomerate of different groups. You got architecture on one side, you've got governance on the other, and obviously we're going to bring both those conversations together today. So welcome, Michelle, welcome, Randy. Thank you for your time. Michelle Peck is the AVP of Enterprise Architecture for Blue Cross of North Carolina, and Randy Mirador is Director of IT Governance for Risk and Compliance for Blue Cross of North Carolina. Michelle, why don't you give us a few-minute introduction, not just of yourself, but what is enterprise and solution architecture, and what does that mean to our audience?
Yeah, good morning, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to speak to everyone. My name is Michelle Peck, and I am a technology leader by trade and a philanthropist at heart. That's how I tag myself. Yep. I've been very fortunate to work across multiple organizations, doing anything from custom development, third-party apps, leading data teams, and all the way through infrastructure. So that broad experience allowed me to come into my current role, which is to lead the enterprise and solution architecture team, which also includes the architecture governance function. And a lot of people say, well, what does that mean? Especially organizations that don't have an architectural organization. And I equate it to building a city, right? So we are the city planners. We work with investors that want to come in and build things and provide a town or a city. So the enterprise architecture team is more like the city planners. They work with the investors to figure out what they need, what kind of town they want. Those teams work with solution architects, which look and say, okay, what kind of buildings do you want? Do you want high rises? Do you want shopping malls? Do you what kind of buildings do you want? And between the two groups, they figure out how the city should be built. So to equate that to an IT organization, the enterprise architects work with our business owners, figure out what they need from a requirements perspective, and they transition those needs to the solution architecture group that figures out the actual solutions that need to be built to meet the needs of the requirements of the business owners. So hopefully that analogy makes sense. Now, the governance function that sits kind of atop all of that makes sure that things are running the appropriate way. You don't have too many high rises. They're not going to cost you a lot of money to build, to make sure that we're aligned with the overarching objectives of the organization in this case. And the three things that we focus on from the architecture perspective, we look at, it's called a three-legged stool. We look at application capabilities, our decision-making process, and the standards that empower the organization to move forward in a cohesive way. Now, the architecture team that I run is agnostic and unbiased, right? So we get lots of opinions. People have some favorites on what they like and what they don't like. But we try to take that, what I call the Switzerland approach, to make sure that we have a unified approach that makes the most sense for the company. So, from a capabilities perspective, we look to see what are the right systems that we need to have. Do we already have them in house? Do we actually need to bring in something else to fill a gap? We also look at our decision making process to make sure we have buy-in from all of our stakeholders, business and IT alike, to make sure we are moving in the right direction to get the thing built, whatever the thing might be, that is cohesive and meets the needs of the business. And then our standards are put in place so that everyone knows going forward the goals, the guidelines, the direction that we need to be put in place to make sure that we have this cohesive environment that we've talked about.
And I'm going to be honest with you, Michelle. I've come from many organizations prior to working with Blue Cross, and it was not until working with you and your team that I truly understood the three-legged stool approach of what your team does. I'll be honest with you. In my younger days, I used to think architects, because I was an applications person, were just in my way. But the truth of the matter is, when done appropriately, all these other things that we always talk about application rationalization, about all these pieces that are required to keep an IT organization functional and efficient, start with your team.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's great working with the entire organization because the diversity of thought is truly important as you come to decisions to figure out what makes the most sense.
Exactly. And I'm sure with an organization like yours, there's a lot of competing challenges and needs. So being able to bring all that together is clearly a lot of work, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
right. Well, let's take it down. So let's take that. That's this side of the equation. Let's talk about the other side of the equation. So Randy, director of IT governance. That's another lovingly unlovable job, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about, especially the risk and compliance. I mean, as part of the resiliency recovery engagement we do with you guys now. I mean, we worked a lot with the risks piece of it. But tell us about yourself, your organization, and how that plays into keeping everything safe for the organization.
Yeah. And keep me within the bounds because I could keep talking. But again, thank you, Chris and Rhino, for including me in this discussion. Again, Randy Mirador, that's my name. I work for my organization. I've been with them for, I'd say, I think this is my 18th year now, and I've
Wow.
only worked in two departments in those 18 years. One being internal audit, and the other being in enterprise security, which is where I'm currently at now. And my current role, as Chris mentioned, is director of IT governance, risk, and compliance. So um, that is I think that is a such a broad title, a broad spectrum of work, and the domain that you can focus on is could be broad. My focus is IT, but slowly but surely we've been um, looking at things outside of IT. But what I want to do is try and latch on to a little bit of what Michelle said, right? So the city planning and building, right? When I think of it from a governance, risk, and compliance perspective, you do need those project managers to ensure that the plans are being followed through, right? They're not building things that are not on the blueprints. You need to make sure that there's some compliance to OSHA or whatever standards that they need to be compliant, have compliance to, and then managing the risks, right? Building tall buildings comes with many different risks, and so documenting those, understanding how to remediate those. There's a lot of synergy there, and I love that you use that analogy, Michelle. And then furthermore, it's too easy, right? It's too easy to say governance, risk, and compliance and align it to this three-legged stool, but I'm going to do that because we
We
have
use
three
the
focuses.
three-legged stool analogy a lot in these LinkedIn lives, so it's good.
Yeah,
So
I mean, it works because without one of those legs, it becomes unstable,
yep.
right? So you need three legs to keep that stool stable and secure, and so on. And so, from my perspective, you have three legs being the obvious: governance, the risk, and the compliance. Governance being things like policies, procedures, right, standards, things of that nature, ensuring that the work is in alignment with organization strategies, things like that. Risk, we do manage a lot of risk where we align to the other risk assurance functions in the organization. That's important, right? Because the work that my team specifically does is focuses on I will call it more of a tactical level around risks, right? And we actually do identify issues as well. There's a distinction there. Not a lot of people make that distinction, but there is a difference between risk and issues, and we make that distinction. We capture both. We manage both. We make sure we're in alignment with an enterprise risk function. We make sure we're in alignment with the audit functions, the compliance functions. And then the final leg is obviously compliance, right? Well, you know, we all work for some company in some industry. We happen to work for a very highly regulated industry. There's a lot of expectation and responsibilities there. There's accountabilities there. There's one, you know, making sure that our work, and not only our work, right, and vendors, making sure our vendors are complying with those same sort of regulations, so that you know, the risk, here I go throwing that out there, is managed appropriately throughout its whole life cycle, whether it's something that we impose on ourselves, whether it's something that's imposed on us through relationships with third parties, whether it's something that we develop, whatever the case is. So hopefully that I did a good job there tying in with Michelle's examples. But
100% yes, and it even ties into our last LinkedIn Live we had on April 4th, which was about vendor compliance and management and cybersecurity and all that. April's been a very good month for us. We've had great people coming in, have wonderful. I haven't had to do much. I've had smarter people talk than I am, and this ties perfectly into that. Vendor management, vendor relationships are becoming huge, as we all know, Change Health and all those other things. To Michelle's point, do you need a new vendor? Do you have a vendor that does it already? Do we need to build a relationship? Does a vendor no longer have the appropriate blueprint or roadmap? Those types of decisions. And then how do you manage that vendor going forward? Obviously brings the whole story together.
yeah, I think Michelle could probably attest to the journey that our organization has gone through related to vendors and contracting with vendors and procuring new technology, new products has evolved. And to state today where, you know, there's a lot of risks that we need to be aware of, right, and to remediate through, and it takes multiple teams, multiple areas. It takes a village, right? It takes the enterprise architecture team. It takes the IT GRC team. It takes the security teams, right? It takes the legal and compliance, because all these different lenses remediate a different piece of the risk that could be introduced. In particular, when you know, when you're an organization that has contracts with thousands of vendors, which I'm sure your audience, a lot of us can relate to that.
Yep.
You know, it's hard to it's really difficult to not only to remediate whatever risks those are, but to keep track of it, right? And then to understand all the technologies that get introduced, and the impacts to, you know, what we need to protect and what we need to ensure is being done in our organization. I mean, it's quite a bit, and so it keeps my team busy. I know that. I know it keeps Michelle's team busy. It keeps everyone with a job. I'll say that.
And we know from our experience as well that it keeps even the applications teams and the infrastructure teams, because they got to come and help put some of the solutions together as well. I mean, we'll talk about risks as we go, but it to your point, it does take a village. All right, so let me tie this in together. So obviously, two critical portions of the equation, but none of it matters if if the business and the rest of IT isn't on board to what you're doing. So tell us how you engage all of your necessary parties to be part of this story with you. Michelle, why don't you start, and then we'll reach over to Randy.
Okay, great. Yeah, we talk a lot about technology, but it really is a combination and a balanced approach of people, process, and technology, right? Because sometimes you may have an initiative the business wants to do, but it's really about process. That has nothing to do with technology. So that's why this collaboration, the cross-functional input that we've been talking about, is so important. And one of the things that we do, and we talked about decisions a minute ago, is that stakeholder engagement and stakeholder buy-in. We might be talking about technology and how great the thing is, but there may be some input from our business teams or IT teams about a process improvement we can do along the way that may mitigate the need for the technology altogether, or it may help us to use that technology in a better way that brings additional value to the company as a whole. So lots of opportunities there for that cross collaboration as we as an organization make decisions around technology as well as the people and process.
So
The other thing we hear a lot too, Chris, is, oh, you're bringing this technology in to get rid of my job, which is not the case, right?
never.
Um, it gives us some opportunities for some of these technologies as part of that stakeholder engagement to talk about how we empower our people to do things differently and do things better and really get productivity out of the teams that we have to grow them not only in their careers, but to help the business meet their objectives.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that more later as well, specifically in the area of AI, which is everybody's favorite topic of the day. But to your point, we all live in that world where I come from the radiology world. When we first went to radiology imaging, and it was always like everyone in the film room is going to lose their jobs. Well, you know what? Nope, they just transition to a new role, a different role, a different process, and everybody just keeps moving forward. So, Randy, let me ask you the same question. Now, you had mentioned also that your focus initially was IT, but I believe now you also are working with the business in more depth in some of those recovery processes. So, why don't you give us the same answer?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the subject or the main risk, controls, compliance, I mean, it all exists in every company, but when you're actually doing the work that's specific to that, it's hard to get folks to engage um, in a manner in which everyone becomes successful. And I'm gonna use some real examples here, right? So, um, everyone experiences incidents, right? Everyone probably has an incident ticketing system, so you report it and all this other stuff. Everyone probably has this concept of major incidents and so on and so forth. But you know, there was a time where there was an uptick in major incidents, right?
Yep.
And so all of a sudden now, so many people get engaged, and the obvious question is why? Why is this happening? Why is there an uptick? Is something wrong? But when you go back to doing appropriate root cause, that kind of thing, it usually leads you back to, wow, we probably identified there was a risk here, and we probably, subsequently identified what the remediation is for these risks, i.e., the controls.
Great.
And without proper engagement, right? To your point, to your question, how do we get them engaged? It fundamentally and philosophically, everybody agrees what a risk is, a control media, et cetera, right? But when it starts to become issues, major issues, impacts our customers, impacts the organization, now all of a sudden there's a spotlight on it,
Yep.
right? And so
Yep.
now they're going, help me document these things, help me understand what should have been done, right? Because at the end of the day, it's interesting because the work that my team does, it seems very, I'll call it reactive in nature, right? We react to things that have already happened,
Okay.
but then it slowly starts to morph into a more of a proactive, because people start to understand that when you have issues in the organizations and you do proper root cause, you start to realize, well, we had these processes, we had these controls, we had these things in place, but maybe we should have had some level of assurance that they were actually being followed through, right? Whether it's a manual process or an automated
Yep.
process, keeping your eye on making sure those things are still relevant and applicable. I'll go back to answering your question, right? How do I get them engaged? Unfortunately, a lot of times it's because issues have occurred,
It's
and now all of a sudden the work that my team has been doing, it starts to get a little bit more visibility, I'll
urgency.
say. Yeah.
So, and I not to interrupt, but because you just triggered something in me. So, if your team is doing their job correctly, and people are documenting risks and addressing risks proactively, then the urgency doesn't happen, and therefore the challenge of getting people to engage even becomes more problematic. So it seems to me that you got to constantly have this loop of what have we done, how have we done, some sort of
Yes.
reporting mechanism in place
Yes.
to show that what we've done has reduced these potential things. And that's hard to do again, because unless you have a cause and effect, it's kind of touchy feely. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah. So one of the things we our I'll call it our business model, right? Is we do. You're right. I mean, we have this. We have a regular touch point with our stakeholders, right? EA included, right? But
Yep.
for the purpose of risks and controls and so on, I'll refer to them as the owners of these things, the risk owners, the control owners. If you don't have the regular touch points with them to discuss these things, then all of a sudden it loses, the focus gets lost. Because if there's no issue, then there's no reason to talk about it.
Exactly.
Right? So there's this concept of risk treatment, right? I mean, one of them being you can mitigate it, obviously. The other one being you can accept it. It's perfectly acceptable. Risk
To
treatment
accept.
is to accept the risk, but that doesn't mean you forget about the risk, and we don't. So we have regular touch points with our stakeholders. We keep them informed. We ask the right questions. We ask, are there major org changes? Everyone goes through org changes seemingly every other month. And so did these org changes change some of your processes or your controls, right? And
More
did
responsible
it
people.
introduce risk?
Yep.
Sometimes big org changes introduce new risks, right? And so it's my job and my team's job to start documenting these things so that we can make sure that you're informed, right? And you're a busy person and everyone else is, but if that's the focus of my team's job, then it's our focus to make sure it stays at the forefront,
Top
and that's
level.
what we do.
Which is critical, because again, in order to do that right, in order to do your job right, that's necessary. So Michelle, I'm going to throw it back to you. You gave a great analogy before of the concept of the city and then how tall are the buildings and working with the business. How do you manage weeding the garden? So let's talk about application rationalization for a moment. Let's talk about what is your process, because obviously I'm sure your inbox of new ideas is huge, but how do you take the time to make sure that we're also grooming the farm, so to speak, and making sure that we're not overgrowing?
Yeah, it's a good question. And especially in our industry, the need for certain applications can be very niche, right? Based on the need of the particular business areas. It's challenging, quite honestly. Looking at the capabilities across our enterprise and what technology we're bringing to bear takes diligence and definitely looking at it on a constant basis. New technology comes out every day. Some of it's vaporware, as this audience is well aware of.
For
Um,
sure.
so you really have to dive in deep with that collaborative team to make sure that you are getting what you need. And sometimes what you have is not good enough. So you have to look at what's new coming in, what you already have, do a comparison, and make sometimes a very hard decision about, hey, this new thing really is better. It is more cost effective, and we need to get rid of the old thing. Now, that's not easy to do from an implementation standpoint, but it is definitely well worth the value at the end of the day.
Exactly. And we talk about this often, both in our one shots and our LinkedIn lives, is the idea that the rationalization piece has to be an ongoing governance. It needs some maturity. It needs some funding, for one, because otherwise you get busy in all the new stuff and you
Right.
never groom the old stuff. And to your point, going back and looking to see what's out there that's better, that's not an easy thing, especially when something's been embedded for many, many years.
That's true.
And then the challenge of getting everyone to say, well, this is worth doing, and it's going to take 3 years, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars. So that's very impressive. How much would you say of your team's time is trying to be proactive on that area as opposed to reactive on the business requests?
Yeah, we look at that perspective every time something new comes in. So the answer is every day.
Every
We
day.
we look at that. And then the older things that we have in house, we will maybe once a year, once every couple of years when the contract renews, go back in and look at it to see if we need to do a new market scan, to see if there's new capabilities out there that might be a better fit for what we need.
Yeah. And I'm just to our audience who will listen to this, we've been speaking of this many, many times. This is exactly what we keep saying. That's exactly how you need to do it. It needs to be ongoing. It can't, application rationalization and all this is not a one and done. It's a forever process. And it's hard to do because it doesn't have the pretty bells and whistles and shiny buttons and all that type of stuff, but it's core to your organization.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move into the topic du jour of every conversation that we're in these days, and that's AI. So obviously, and we've had a lot of great conversations with subject matter experts across the field in different organizations, and they're very kind to give us an hour of their time when we speak about common goals and common issues. 20 minutes of it easily is on AI and the challenge. I don't care if we're talking with a security person, a chief technology officer, a CIO, a business person. So how are you managing AI requests? To your point, vaporware AI, real AI, generative AI, predictive AI, and at what point does this become part of your ongoing, or does this become a separate leg within your organization?
Yeah, Randy, do you want to start off?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a hot area, just like most other companies, and it's one in which our organization has some focus on for obvious reasons. There's a lot of risks here. I'll say that from a security perspective, the first thing we did was we shut out access to the public access to AI, right? Like the chat GPTs and so on. And then we've implemented some governance around the usage of AI. So because we recognize that there's some real use cases here. Uh, um, but from the standpoint of governance and what we do, I'm not gonna pretend I'm an expert in AI, right? I want to put that out there. But just like a lot of leaders, you surround yourself with people that are probably smarter than yourself. And so, from an AI governance perspective, I do have a very intelligent people that are legitimately well versed and have a lot of experience in this area. And so, my role or our role is to make sure there's appropriate guardrails around use of this, particularly if it's developed internally. There's appropriate controls even if we're procuring something from a vendor that is going to have a Gen AI component to it. We do a lot of due diligence around that. More so than we do. I also own the security third-party risk for security controls on our vendors. It's similar, but we do much more. I will say due diligence on this piece because it requires us to actually see the tools in action sometimes, right? To understand, to make sure that what they're selling is what we're getting. What uh, there's no gaps in how they develop these things, right? From a control perspective, understanding whether there's a reliance outside of their own product, right? Maybe there's some of these vendors are relying on their own third parties for some of the development of their products. It's all of that, right? It's it's understanding that the contract language when we go through this new technology introduction process, right? Getting new technology, and we have to have the right contracts in place that speak to this thing. I say AI, but there's just so much there,
Yeah.
Chris.
Well, I agreed, and we hear that from everybody. And what we hear is again the challenge. And Michelle, I'll turn this over to you in a moment. Is the challenge that the businesses are knocking on the door. The businesses don't necessarily even know what they want or asking for. They just know again there's opportunity, and between your teams, I would think that you got to kind of look at both sides of it and bring it together. So again, Michelle, how has that increased your level of business?
Yeah, I will tell you, if the term "it takes a village" applies anywhere, it's definitely in this space.
Yeah.
I have a peer who is focused on the AI ML Gen AI space. I have an architect specifically focused on that to make sure that we have alignment from that perspective. We work with Randy's team to make sure that governance component is definitely in place. And the challenge is it is exciting stuff. It is exciting times for making opportunities available for the business to increase their revenue or do things better. And where is the balance between exploring safely, by the way,
Yes, safely.
into new things that we think are going to provide us value, educating and communicating what it is and sometimes what it isn't, as you kind of mentioned,
Mhm.
to actually implementing it in a way that's going to make sense. When we started down our journey, because it was brand new and coming out of the woodwork, we started down a custom development path because we could control it. We had our own large language models or LLMs, trying to figure out how can we use this technology and build it ourselves. Well, as time progressed, some of our third-party vendors started doing the same thing, and we're finding that now we've got a choice. We can either build it internally or we can go through a vendor, but to Randy's point, you got to make sure that they are following the processes that we require specifically for our industry to make sure that we are getting the value we need, but we also protect our data in particular of our industry's organization.
Well, Michelle, I'm going to invite you more often because you keep backing up everything that we've been saying for months. So thank you. When we talked about AI and what Rhyno can do on your AI strategy, and part of that is to determine how much of it's vendor related and how much of it's development related. Because every organization's got their different levels of how much of it they are a true development organization versus a buy versus build type of thing. So that's interesting. You started more on the development side, and then you kind of shifting more when the opportunity approaches itself to work with vendors directly.
Yeah, we definitely look at all the perspectives, again, being, the agnostic party, because sometimes one thing would work today, and then we have to go back and look at it again and say, wow, this vendor's coming in doing this and it's a better fit. So maybe we need to shift and pivot directions.
All right, I'm going to just before we jump on to the next topic, I'm just going to throw a question out there. So and this is a challenge for everybody. This is not particular to your or organization or your business or anything. How often does it happen where there's a solid recommendation, a solid path of opportunity, a solid ROI, and yet you can't get the backing to move it forward?
For my organization, it happens quite often, especially in the Gen AI space, um, because it's so new and we're still trying to figure out what it is and what it isn't. On a larger scale, I think because our organization is so collaborative with the right stakeholders engaged, it doesn't, change in direction and getting funding generally is the exception, not the rule, thank goodness. So that's a positive. But there are changes. Randy mentioned changes in the organization. Sometimes that has a play into some of the decision making because you have new decision makers that come to the game, right, to talk about stuff. But I think our organization has done an excellent job of looking at what the business needs are and prioritizing accordingly. So if we go in with a recommendation that aligns to that enterprise strategy, we're usually pretty successful.
Yeah, that's interesting too, right? Because, from the business side, that is a large focus, right? It's like, what can it do for me? How much money can we save or revenue can be generated, et cetera, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's sort of what's important to them. But, my team sometimes becomes that hurdle. And while I can't, we don't have the ability to stop the procurement of a tool, for example. But we actually, we would be the voice of reason, if you will, right? We would ask the questions. We would want to make sure that everything is covered, if you will, from a from a risk and control perspective. And sometimes there are times where the recommendation is to not move forward
Right.
with this. Now, whether they do or not, it's obviously a business decision because sometimes no risk, no reward, right? I mean, that's a very common saying, but it's true. Sometimes they accept the risk and they move forward with it. But it's our job to make sure that all the bases were covered, that you were made aware of those, and if you choose to move forward, we'll document something, a risk, get some acknowledgement around it, because in our industry you just never know what could happen. And then ultimately, where does the accountability lie if there were like a cyber breach or something like that, right? Because in our industry, it's the buck stops here.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether we relied on a third party. You,
No,
you know what I mean?
exactly.
But 100%, one of the questions that would get asked in any investigation of an incident would be, did you perform a risk assessment? And like, how did you come up with the decision to do X, i.e. a risk assessment? And the good news is, we get involved with different stakeholders, and we have a centralized, tooling, a repository where we document those kinds of things. And guess what? That question gets asked, and the answer is, of course we did, and here it is.
And here it is.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense, and that kind of leads into our next area. So thank you all for that great detail. But your organization is a lot more mature than others. As you said, Randy, you've been there for 18 years in 2 different jobs. Michelle, I know you've been there for at least 5 or 6 years in your current role. Talk to other companies that are not in the maturity that you are. How would they get started? What are the right things? And we'll take both of your perspectives in each area. What's the right things to do? What are the things that have to be in place? What are those things, like you just said, Randy's, you want to make sure that you can point to this every single time? So Michelle, why don't we start with you, and then we can go to Randy.
Sure. So if you have no governance, architecture governance, I'll speak to that, or a small footprint, my recommendation is don't try to boil the ocean. There's a lot of things you can dive into. There's a lot of areas you can focus on. I would suggest you put together a list of your top 5 priorities as it relates to architecture governance and focus on those. It may be financial. It may be, looking at your capabilities you already have and what you need. It could be something as simple as, who are my stakeholders, right? To get into the discussions. But start small and then iterate. And if you run into something, as governance is, and you need to pivot, right? Pivot, because you're going to learn more and more as you go along through your organization, especially with the conversations with business teams of what makes sense for you and what does not make sense for you.
Perfect. Thank you. Randy, same question to you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. A few years ago, um, a small organization, right, that not as mature, wanted to do business with our organization, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't sign a contract for one reason or another, probably related to the maturity of the company. Uh, so somebody reached out to me and said, "Can you talk to this person from this company and maybe advise them what could they have done or could do so that they can do business with you?" Right? Which it's sort of related to your question. And so
100%.
with our industry, we're beholden to very strict regulations, and the risks related to that gets carried through to the people you do business with. So in that specific example, my recommendation was to look at your processes, look at your products, look at your services, and ask yourself, can it can it can you comply to these regulations, right? And so in general, what I'll say is, you know, and bear in mind, this is coming from someone who spent 18 years in either audit or GRC, right? My recommendation is follow some type of standard, right? Whether you're an IT, whether you're a developer, whether you're in operations, follow some kind of standard and then document it, because it should be repeatable. You shouldn't have people going off the reservation, particularly the 2 people doing the same job, right? You should be doing some things with some level of regularity and normality. It should be repeatable, right? It should be auditable, uh, because you just never know, particularly if you're in a regulated industry, obviously. Um, and it reminds me of this saying. I don't remember. I think it was it might have been Warren Buffett. Risk risk comes from not knowing what you're doing,
I like
right?
that.
And so I take that and I'm like, that is 100% true. So how do you know what you're doing? Well, document it, right? Create some policy, create some procedures, create some sort of standards around some of the things. And it doesn't have to be everything right away, but I think the things that are, if you're a development company, it certainly should be your development process, right? If you're a product company, you shouldn't have the developer also testing, who's also approving, who's also pushing it out to production. I mean, you
Pushing the
should
code
have
out. Yeah.
segregation of duties there, right? That's an obvious thing, right? So depending on what company you're trying to stand up, I think you should look at the processes and how you do things and what you're putting out there and what you're offering, and then ask yourself, what if there's some implications around compliance. Can you comply to it, or not?
Yeah, to add to that, but be practical about it though, right? Because
Yeah.
you can put so many policies and procedures in place that nobody's going to follow them. So really hone in on what makes sense for your particular organization. Because if you put too many out there, nobody's going to follow it.
Well, and that's a great point because we're a mid-sized business, so to speak, and we see each year additional requirements that we need to do as an organization, and we've got to grow into them as well. And so it always goes back to the nimble versus restrictive. But to your point, you've got to find that middle road, and you can't look at it on either side. You can't just say, we're going to be 100% nimble or we're going to be 100% documented restrictive. You've got to kind of find that middle ground, especially in organizations our size. Thank you. That was very helpful. All right. So what else can we talk? I'm going to turn it over to you one last time. And what is there anything else you want to share with the audience, particularly to your area, particularly to how you engage into your both your business, and we focused a lot on how you engage the business, but also how you also engage within your own IT organization, how you do communications. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience? Michelle, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, that as it relates to governance in particular in the architecture, you have to grow and you have to change because things do change in the industry, in the organization, in the technology. It's an ever evolving process. So don't think you're going to check the box and you're done because you're not. You definitely have to continue to learn and evolve. And the more people you get engaged in the process, the better it's going to be because the more proactive, as Randy talked about a little bit ago, that you can be, the less likely you're going to have to get everybody together to deal with an incident, right? So if you can continue to focus on that and that process improvement, if you will, the better your end result will be long term.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's like a wise person says, one of the favorite sayings, this is a journey. And the work that I do, my team does, it certainly is. It's never governance, risk, compliance, particularly in a regulated industry. I mean, it never ends. Things happen, things pop up, things change. You pivot when you need to pivot. One of the functions that is also under my organization is resiliency. And so that word really sort of sticks out to me because it means a lot of things. It could mean a lot of things depending on the subject matter. But I think about organizations' resiliency and understanding the resiliency is probably predicated on understanding what their pitfalls are, right? What the risks are, but continuing to move forward and managing sort of that balance between taking risks and not taking risks, and leveraging new technology or building it on your own, and all these things, right? And it all sort of lends itself well to being I'll call a resilient organization. And so that hopefully the function that a GRC team or area does is to help an organization be just that.
And we've spoken about this a lot. Go back to our three-legged stool analogy, especially with risk. Risk, they fall into three buckets. They either need to be remediated, they need to be insured, or they need to be accepted. And none of those are wrong answers.
That's right.
As long as you can explain how you landed there, and that you go into Michelle's point, you don't just check a box and move on. You go back and review and adjust as you go.
You don't forget about them, right? I mean, it's even if you accept them, you just don't forget about them. You got to be aware of them.
Whenever we have one of these LinkedIn lives, I usually time when the first time we use the word governance, because in everything we talk about, it comes down to that, which is very interesting. I don't care if we're talking about resiliency recovery or your data center strategy or application rationalization or AI or data or whatever. It all comes to that rinse and repeat cycle that needs to happen on a regular basis.
Right.
Listen, it's been fantastic talking to you both. It really was. It's a great way to lead into the weekend. I just wanted to thank you both for taking the time. Any last words for the audience?
I think if you want to reach out to Randy and I, LinkedIn is a good way to do that. If you have questions or if your organization is, trying to figure out what do I do, I think reaching out through LinkedIn, Randy, right, is probably the best way to do that.
LinkedIn is an excellent avenue to reach if anyone has any questions or want me to provide any additional information on anything I've said. It'd be great if you could reference that you saw us on Rhyno's
There you go.
podcast. That would be wonderful. As probably everyone on this call, you get bombarded with things out of LinkedIn, requests and messages and whatnot. But I try and do my best to filter through those things and respond to them. But yes, LinkedIn is a great way to reach me.
And again, we'll be posting this whole production on LinkedIn as well as snippets. So if anything comes through on the Rhyno side, we'll make sure they reach out and get to you directly. But again, thank you both very much. It was a pleasure seeing you both and talking with you both. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
You too. Bye-bye.